You're back already. Okay, cool. Gimmicks, I know. We can... Hello, lovely people. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed those 2 quick videos, and now you're back with me, and we can talk a bit about that paper and trying to just at least begin an outline or argument diagram of what's going on in that little article there. Look, I will say this article I think makes an interesting argument. Doesn't mean I agree with it. I just figured this is the sort of arguments you will be seeing in your everyday lives, because this is a publication. And so I think it's good to practice on these types of things. And then eventually, of course, we'll be seeing much more sophisticated philosophical arguments later in the course. But now I just want you to see, because look, maybe you'll never read another philosophy text after this class. I'm sorry. You should be a major. Join me. Join me.
Come play with us, Daddy.
What was that? Anyhow, so... But you will have to read regular stuff and get good at, identifying arguments pretty much just as a matter of being, living a life and dealing with things. So this will be a good practice. But this article, this is a very disorganized video. I have the slides in front of me that just have the pictures, which I'll flash up to you as we're going. In my other hand, I have the actual article here with all my notes on it, which I'll flash up, at least the article up, so you can see what stuff I'm looking at as I'm going along here. It's a bit disorganized, I understand, but the article itself, sorry, back to that, is a little bit disorganized. He repeats a lot of points that he makes earlier, and then sometimes it's just the same point, other times there's a little elaboration. So what I'm trying to do is I've went through this several times to try to find the structure. So don't feel embarrassed or sad if you're like, wow, how did he come up with that? I mean, it took me a few times through to really kind of get the thrust of his argument, but also note that this is an art form and different people could have different diagrams. The only thing I would say is that the premises, the boxes I have, should look sensible and familiar. How you're arranging them sometimes can be different. So don't feel like there's only one right way to do this. I'm just giving you a way that I think is pretty sensible and did help me understand exactly what the author was trying to do. Because it's one thing to read the article and walk away, oh yeah, okay, he doesn't like the Sacklers, but another to actually have to sit down and try to uncover what exactly is the argument he's making. And you discover there's a lot of stuff in there that you really don't need to include in the argument. It's just examples or side observations or things that are important, but not really for the argument. Okay, well, that's enough. So how I approached this is I read the article through once. I was underlining claims, statements that I thought were pretty important. And the good news is the conclusion was pretty quick. We'll come to that in a moment. But what I did is that I was underlining, and then I actually pulled out a Post-it note thing and started peeling off important claims, and I stuck them to a wall in my apartment, and then I was moving them around trying to put together the argument and all, and so it was, I think that's not a bad way to do it. I'm a very visual person, and that helps me. And even, it's funny, I'll show you behind the curtain. I do this because I'm living a very sad bachelor life without my wife. My wife is having fun in the Middle East, and I'm here living like a student, I guess. But you can see my wall back there. There's the Post-it notes still up there. They'll probably fall down at some point. Maybe I'll leave them up and just show them to guests and be like, what do you think of this argument against the Sacklers? So, but that was the first thing I did, and then I arranged them, and now I can kind of show you when I put together the diagram for it. Now, the nice thing about this article is the conclusion is obvious. Heck, the conclusion is pretty much stated in the introduction, the case for prosecuting the Sacklers and other opioid executives. And you go in onto the second page and you get a pretty clear statement about that develops what exactly that statement is. And so I throw that main conclusion into a box because I'm going to diagram it, and I'll just read it. What I wrote here is the Sacklers and other owners, executives of opioid companies should face criminal charges with the possibility of prison time. I believe that captures the main point of this paper, is to convince us of this claim. Everything is done is ultimately seems to be for trying to persuade us that this is true. Again, it's at times it can be a little confusing to follow with the repetitions and kind of making a point, talking about something else, coming back. And so I understand, but I think once I've shown you what I've put together, you'll be able to go back and really be able to see what's going on a lot clearer. So the conclusion, though, at least, whew, thanks. And now we got all those Post-it notes now up there that I have to figure out, okay, well, how the heck do these things come together to make an argument justifying this? Well, I figure that if we take and look at this claim, there's three parts to it that need to be justified. The first obvious is that the Sacklers should be prosecuted. This group of people, he names names. You can read the paper. He names, I believe, 7 Sacklers he believes absolutely should be prosecuted. But also that thesis mentions other executives. And so that's a separate point, that these not only are the Sacklers, that's one box. Another point is that other owners and executives of these companies ought to be prosecuted as well. So that's a separate claim. So one's about showing why the Sacklers, another has to show why others as well should be prosecuted. And then the kind of last point there is that these charges are very specific. They're going to be criminal charges with prison time. These will not be civil charges. Pause for a moment. Just so if you're familiar with the legal system, maybe this makes already sense to you. If you're not familiar with the legal system, it's just, I'm not going to go into the details. I'm not a lawyer. Do not take any legal advice from Professor Gray. Unless you like jail, then feel free. But criminal charges usually do carry pretty stiff penalties, like going to jail, which is what the author here is talking about. Usually if it's a civil crime, that's usually the most you can get is maybe a fine, like you have to pay some money. So for instance, the famous case from when I was I your age? No, I was even younger than you guys. When O.J. Simpson was put on trial for murdering his wife. A very famous case that your parents probably know about, maybe you've heard about, but the trial that everyone knows about was the criminal trial. Namely, if he was found guilty of murdering his wife, he would have gone to jail. That's a criminal. He was found innocent. But for various reasons, a lot of people did think he was guilty. And so what they did is the families of the victim took him to court again, but this time in a civil trial. So and OJ lost that trial, but OJ did not go to jail. You do not go to jail in a civil trial, but he had to pay some fines, or was supposed to, and that's a whole other thing. But anyway, criminal prosecution, the goal is usually jail time or something, pretty extreme, whereas in civil cases, the penalties tend to be financial. You pay a fine. Okay, so back to this argument. So we see 3 claims. And notice these are dependent claims. They all need each other. If one of these is shown false, that statement at the bottom in the box has to be changed. Because for instance, if the Sacklers should not be prosecuted, the argument there just fails. Well, then the box at the bottom, the main conclusion, no longer works because the Sacklers have to be erased and this whole thing has to be rewritten. And notice that applies to the others. If the other executives are innocent, then you have to change that box again at the bottom and erase the other owners. And another key component is that about what kind of charges they need to be. They need to be prosecuted, but not civilly, criminally. You get rid of any one of these boxes, the main conclusion is no longer valid. At the best, it would have to be changed in some way. And I think the author would be pretty annoyed if he had to give up any one of these, because then his paper wouldn't sell. So anyhow, so we have 3 kind of things, at least, and maybe you can look at this and find there might be other claims in there that could be put into boxes and go there. But I've picked these 3 main ones. Now that said, I will just ignore one of them. I'll put a question mark going into it because I think the author does say why he thinks other owners should be prosecuted, but the author doesn't spend as much time. So I'll leave it to you to go back to the article and figure out why he thinks other executives. But we'll focus on the Sacklers, since that's what the majority of the article is about. The majority of the article is about the Sacklers, with significant time spent explaining why the charges should be criminal with prison time. So we'll focus on those 2, and I'll leave it to you guys to figure out how he then says that other owners who are not the Sacklers should also be prosecuted. All right, well, let's focus first then on the Sacklers should be prosecuted and see, well, what are the reasons the author gives us? Now, there's a lot. And I'm not even going to put them all in. I'm going to put what I think is the main thread of thought that the author has here. But I feel that you probably can reread it and find some other reasons that the author gives for prosecuting the Sacklers. I'll just focus on what the author spends the most time talking about. I hope that makes sense. And so I think we get 2 main claims here, one of which goes pretty quick. He just assumes you would agree. And the other he spends, again, more time on. The one that he says kind of quickly with statistics and things is that the opioid crisis is a very bad thing. If you look, and he gives reasons for that, And I won't go into all of them. Again, I think this is pretty straightforward from the videos, the other videos, as well as the article itself. Talks a lot about why this opioid crisis is just in of itself a bad thing. Because you have to show that, right? I mean, if the opioid crisis is a good thing, we can just stop now. There's nothing. What are we talking about? So on the one hand, the crisis is bad, but that's linked up to the fact that the Sacklers, he argues, share personal responsibility for the opioid crisis. Now, here's another segue, a little important point. He's saying personal because he says, we're going to we are going to criminally charge these specific people. Remember, he names like 7 Sacklers. He names these, gives them their names. They're in the paper. I even made a family tree. Maybe I'll take a picture and post the family tree I wrote. I was trying to figure, who are all these people? But he says they're personally responsible. So when we go to court, we're going to say, you, and you're all responsible for this. Now, that is different from what usually happens here. What he talks about what's happened in the past is that the company gets sued. And that means you can't put a company in jail, right? You can basically just fine it, and maybe it goes bankrupt. But at the end of the day, a company you can't lock up in jail. Mainly the punishment to companies are heavy fines. Maybe some regulatory things happen, like they can't sell certain goods or operate in certain countries, whatever. But usually no one goes to jail when you sue a company. It's just the company pays a fine or is punished. The company is punished. The people in the company may not be punished at all. I hope that makes sense. But here he's saying he wants these people to be punished. He says, I don't care. Save that for another argument about punishing the company. I want to talk about these people and how they are personally responsible in some way for this opioid crisis. Now, note, he doesn't say they're the only people responsible. There's probably a lot of people responsible. But he's saying these Sacklers, these 7 people he names, they are responsible. And that thing that they're responsible for is a very bad thing. And so we should prosecute. Again, these are dependent. Because if the opioid crisis were a good thing and the Sacklers were responsible for this good thing, well, let's give them medals, not lock them up or, do something like that. So we need both things. We need to say that the Sacklers did something and that something is very bad. And like I mentioned, I'll just put a question mark going into the opioid crisis being bad. I think you can look up in the article and videos and to find out why it's bad. So let's focus then on the more interesting claim about these people, these 7 people being personally responsible for this big, or having a share of responsibility. And they're not the only ones responsible, but having a big part of this. And this also has, I think, 2 main claims. Indeed, I think these 2 claims here are probably what he spends almost all of the paper talking about. So one thing he notes, I'll look on the one that has less words in it first, which is about the company. The company is Purdue Pharma. And he says the company contributed to this crisis. And I'm going to leave it to you guys to figure out. This might be a good question to think about is what's the evidence the author gives? He has a whole section. He calls it, what does he call it in here? He says, how OxyContin helped lead to the opioid crisis. That section is where he starts to lay out why the company is somewhat partially responsible for the opioid crisis. And he repeats a few of the points later on. He comes back to and develops. But he does marshal evidence. I'll leave it to you to figure out what the evidence is for the company. So that's about the company. But now that's not enough to show the company did bad. He has to connect the Sacklers because the Sacklers are the owners and executives of that company. Again, he mentions the 7 people who were key executives involved in the company of Purdue Pharma. And so he says the Sacklers are ultimately responsible for the actions of their company during the opioid crisis. And now you can start to see it, that if the company did things to create this crisis or help create this crisis, and these people were in charge of that company and they're responsible for those actions, then we can start to shift into that area of that the Sacklers share personal responsibility. It's not just the company that contributed, it's the people who were responsible for the company, the Sacklers. And again, he has a whole section on trying to link up about why he thinks the Sacklers were responsible for the actions of the company. The section here is called "The Sacklers Let Purdue the Sacklers led Purdue for much of the opioid crisis. And he mentioned some points there and then comes back to later on. And so again, I won't go into, so I'm going to put a question mark in both of those. I think those are good assignments for you to think about. I've pointed you where to start, but again, he does talk about these repeatedly throughout. Again, it's not the most organized, but now you know what you're looking for. You want to look for the reasons the author gives for why Purdue contributed to the opioid crisis. That's one task. And then another task is to look over and find the reasons that show why the Sacklers were indeed responsible for what their company was doing. It wasn't someone else making the decisions, it was them. And they're the ones who made the company do what it did. And he has a couple arguments there too. Not crazy big. I've done the hard work, I hope. But again, I think you can now start looking for these reasons. So finally, then we can look at the charges must be criminal, not civil, with the possibility of prison time. This he talks about at the beginning of the paper, and then he comes back at the end that this is a chance to fight a culture of impunity. So we can already start to see what that argument's going to look like with just that language. The culture of impunity must be destroyed. But let's back up. Let's make it a little less inflammatory and just more straightforward about what the author's argument is going to be like. So again, he says the charges must be criminal, not civil, and I hopefully explained that well enough, with the possibility of prison time. Again, that's the key idea. The prison time is going to be what's important. And so I'm going to move some stuff to the side since things are getting a little cluttered now. These things, oh man, these argument diagrams are fun, right? So let's see. I think there's two main reasons he gives for why the charges must be criminal, not civil. And I'll do, again, I guess the shorter one first, is that the charges must deter others from misleading and aggressively marketing dangerous products. So this is where he talks a lot about deterring things. We want to prevent others from doing the same thing. And so he says, no matter what we do with our charges, whatever the charges are, they must prevent or make others not want to do the same thing. And this is where he talks a lot about the culture of impunity. Again, I will leave it to you to think about why what his justification for that claim is, that the charges must deter others from doing those things. I'll put that to the side to leave it to you. And then we can look at the other claim, which is the criminal charges with the possibility of prison time are a greater deterrence than civil charges with the possibilities of fine. So this is laying out what I explained earlier, that criminal charges usually involve prison as a punishment, whereas civil charges usually involve fines, paying out something as the punishment. And so let's focus on that one. Again, I'll let you think about why the charges must be for deterrence, end that culture of impunity, which he talks about. That's for you. But I'll just focus on this last box here on criminal charges being our greater deterrence than civil charges. And I think this is a pretty easy argument. Maybe it doesn't need too much thought, like the first premise being no one wants to go to prison. I don't want to go to prison. Do you want to go to prison?
Worst thing about prison was the Dementors. They were flying all over the place, and they were scary, and then they come down and they suck the soul out of your body, and then, hi!
No, I don't want to go to prison. Yeah, so no one wants to go to prison. And then he notes the second claim there is that the rich are not deterred by fines, which they can easily afford to pay. He notes that the Purdue's, what did they have? They were had $11 billion, and now they're only going to have $2 billion or $1 billion. And he's like, that's still more money than any person could ever spend in a lifetime. And so, yeah, even if you're charging them $10 billion, sounds like a lot. To someone with so much money, it doesn't matter. And so he's saying, yeah, the rich are not deterred. So that's why we need criminal charges. The threat of prison is a much stronger deterrent then. And again, you can see how these come together. They're both, again, it's kind of interesting that he does a lot of dependencies where he makes claims that link together that give us a pretty sophisticated conclusion. So in this case, yeah, no one wants to go to prison and they're not worried about the fines. You put that together and then you see why criminal charges are more powerful than civil charges for deterrence. Okay. And so then we can back up and see the whole argument there. Wow, it's crazy. I've given you a few question marks of further thought where you might think about how does he justify what goes into that box. I'll give you for free, no one wants to go to prison. I mean, that's a pretty weird situation if someone wants to go to prison.
Wow. Prison sounds horrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And what we can think about with this then is take our concepts of soundness and validity. Now remember, soundness has two parts. The first part being the premises should all be true. So I've marked in yellow there, the premises. These all have to be true. I mean, that's the basic point, right? If our starting points are wrong, then who cares? That's the easiest. That's one part of validity. I'm sorry, of soundness. Thank you. And so again, we have to think they're true, and that the question marks might help you flesh out whether or not you think these starting points are true. And again, I'll leave that to you. And then remember, validity, that's the other part of soundness. Soundness is everything, the premises are true and the argument is valid. That's the second part. And so here with validity, we just assume that all the starting points, I've marked them now in blue, we just assume for the sake of argument, suppose they are true. Do the arrows do the work? Hopefully, I've tried my best to make the arrows not the problem, but you might have to look at some of these arrows and think, is that true? Just because you have the things in blue being true, is that enough to really give you what the arrows are trying to show? I'll leave it to you to decide if you think some of these inferences, some of these arrows are bad. But that's the argument as a whole, this whole thing. And that's, and now I hope you can look at this paper and pinpoint areas for where you can, provide more from the article, like how did pharma, the company, contribute to the crisis, or why were the Sacklers responsible for the actions during this crisis? All right, well, that's heavy. That's really all I have for you in this unit now. So the next thing you're going to do, first, arm flap. Oh, get rid of that flap. Oh, man. What's going on down there? I don't want to know. So pat yourself on the back through another video. So what you have left to do here, you got some tweeting to do. You got I got a module quiz to take, and then the exam. Do budget your time. I'm going to the exam isn't meant to be impossibly even long. It's just trying to find that time when you're not being distracted to just sit down and respond to what the exam is asking. So do try to set aside a few hours so you can really focus on that exam and not be distracted by other stuff. In the meantime, if you're ahead of the game and it's not released yet, then I would just say start writing up notes, collecting things together so that when the exam comes, you don't have to do much looking up. You can just start typing away and answer all the questions. But I'll talk more about that in a video very soon. Too soon, I suppose. I'm sorry. But just remember, free passes and dropping of the lowest. You can do this. Don't let anyone else tell you otherwise. I believe in you. I do. Anyhow, that's more than enough. All right. Hey, take care. Stay safe. And I'll see you soon